Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Z. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in transgender care. Welcome to my channel. Today, I would like to discuss with you Blanchard autogynephilia theory. Yes, time has come for me to share with you my thoughts, what exactly the theory is, and especially if I have seen cases of individuals who claim to fit this theory to a T, and what do I make of them. So I will be discussing with you Blanchard autogynephilia theory as was first actually presented and coined by Blanchard himself. Ray Blanchard is a psychologist, and he coined this term in 1989. Specifically, I will be discussing the way Blanchard theorized this concept of autogynephilia toward trans feminine individuals and the causality and the link he claimed to exist between this causality of autogynephilia and gender dysphoria. I will summarize his theoretical proposition so that way, if you never heard about the theory, you'll have a very clear understanding what it is. Then I will discuss researchers and writers such as Julie Serrano, who may have been very much familiar to a lot of you. She has done a lot of trans activism, and she has done a lot of great writings, as well as Charles Moser, among many others, and their main critique points of the autogynephilia theory. Following by my personal clinical observations and decades, keep in mind, I have up to now 17 exact years of direct experience working with solely transgender adults. So I will be sharing with you my thoughts on this theory as well. And finally, I'm going to share my insights as to why some trans adults identify and feel resonant to this theory to this day. And yes, there are those who feel like the theory describes them. So keep in mind, this is going to be a long video, so make sure you have a cup of coffee, tea, beverage of choice. I have water right here for myself because it is a long video. I also going to put most relevant and most important timestamps below in the video description, so that we can jump around in terms of what's really relevant to you if you feel like you don't want to sit out for the whole video, although I do recommend for you to sit out because there are going to be a lot of points I will be illuminating, and I bet some of the points were not even familiar to you. So I'm also going to have pop-up visuals to help you with attention focus, given how lengthy this video is. So please also note, many may feel triggered by this discussion of autogynephilia. So please make sure you take care of yourself. Make sure you can step away from the video if you feel triggered or uncomfortable. And I also want to say, if you have been a follower of my content, I do hope you can trust me with mindful delivery of this touchy and very controversial subject. So let's get started. Many of you may have heard of the concept of autogynephilia, and many have not. So let's just first go over the main concept of what this theory is. The theory of autogynephilia, or more accurately, actually Blanchard autogynephilia theory, derives from Blanchard transsexualism typology that suggests to explain the psychological typology of gender dysphoria and transsexualism. Simply put, it's a theory that aims to explain why trans women specifically develop transgender identity. So keep in mind, Blanchard looked specifically at trans women. He did not generalize this theory to trans men or non-binary individuals. In other words, why someone assigned male at birth desires to transition to a female. Over a period between 85 and 93, Blanchard published a series of papers describing his theory and his observations, which were later summarized in detail by Anne Lawrence in this book. I have it on my desk. If you haven't read it, don't worry. I have read this book for you twice. Actually, I read it way back many years ago before I started my practice, because obviously being familiar with all different concepts and theories and points is important. And I just reread it in order to make this video, to make sure that my observations and my thoughts and my conceptualizations are still accurate. And in the very least, I wanted to be mindful and toward Anne Lawrence and also Ray Blanchard, who after all are colleagues in the field, to be mindful to their research and their findings before I go in discussing what I think about the theory. This book still remains to be the main text on Blanchard autogynephilia theory. So if you were to go after one main text, it would be this book. So the first thing you need to understand and know about this theory is that it is sex-based in nature. What it means is that it describes one's sexual orientation as a root cause of gender dysphoria and a desire to transition in trans female. Therefore, the central point of autogynephilia theory is that there are two and only two types of trans women, and that their desire to seek surgical transition arises out of their sexual orientation. One group of trans women type, according to this theory, and I am very almost verbatim extrapolating from the book, by the way, just to give you an idea how I am being very, I guess, pure and true in describing Blanchard theory. So one group of trans women type, according to this theory, consists of people who have a lifelong history of female typical interests, behaviors, and personality characteristics dating back to childhood. So from early times, these individuals behaved like girls, identified with girls, and often proclaimed they are a girl. Their mannerism, activities, and even toy preferences were female typical. They began to cross-dress or more accurately feminize openly in childhood and continued into adulthood. Their feminine activities were not associated with sexual arousal, and as they grew up, their sexual orientation was toward men. Hence, Blanchard called this first group of trans women homosexual transsexuals. Now, I know it's confusing because if a trans woman is attracted to a man, that makes her heterosexual in her sexual preference. Blanchard, however, decided to disregard this claiming because they are exclusively sexually attracted to men and thus homosexual relative to their biological sex. This demonstrates to me that he anchors gender to sex and does not believe in gender identity formation, a point I will discuss with all of you later. Now, the second, remember I said there's two subtypes that Blanchard proposes. Now, the second subtype of transgender feminine person, according to Blanchard theory, is someone who strongly desires to be a woman, but displays few or no interest in feminine activities, behaviors, or even tendencies. So from early childhood, in contrast to the first group, these individuals knew they were boys and behaved like boys. Their interests were stereotypically male, as opposed to the first group, where their interests were stereotypically female, and they favored boys as playmates. Some began to cross-dress or feminize in early childhood, almost always in secrecy, according to Blanchard. So they all kept it very, very secret. Nearly all were cross-dressing secretly by the time of puberty, and their cross-dressing was associated with intense sexual arousal. As they grew up, their activities and careers were male-dominant. They were either sexually attracted to women or would fantasize about sex with men, but only when also fantasizing about themselves as women. At other times, they found the idea of having sex with men as unappealing or even disgusting. Now, Blanchard called the second group of trans women as non-homosexual transsexuals. Later, they were referred to as autogynephilic transsexuals because these people almost always, according to Blanchard, shared an unusual erotic interest called autogynephilia, a propensity to be erotically aroused by the thought of being a female. So to sum it up, Blanchard theory says there are only two subtypes of trans women: those who have a history of feminine traits and behaviors and no sexual arousal upon cross-dressing, who are only attracted to men and are homosexual trans. And trans women who have masculine traits and behaviors always experience some sexual arousal or fantasy about themselves as women, are not attracted to men, and are non-homosexual trans, or more currently, autogynephilic. Blanchard thus theorized that all, or virtually all, and by the way, I am taking all statements directly from Lawrence Brooks, so I'm quoting verbatim. This is not me making this theory very explicit to particular individuals. This is how Blanchard has theorized. So Blanchard theorized that all, or virtually all, Trans women were either exclusively homosexual, falling to the first group, or were non-homosexual and autogynephilic. He's using the non-homosexual and autogynephilic is really one group. Additionally, Blanchard emphasized the erotic fantasy of onset as a female as a central root of a desire to be a woman. The word autogynephilia actually exactly means literally the love of oneself as a woman. This is why he decided to use this term, because he felt it was very appropriately to describe the phenomenon. The theory gets actually even more complex because Ray suggests that there are 4 main types of autogynephilia. Transvestic, which involves wearing women's clothes. Anatomic, involving possessing female anatomic features. Physiologic, having female physiologic functions. And behavioral, involving engaging in stereotypical female activities. Later, Blanchard actually proposed another type, which we can call 5th type, called partial anatomic autogynephilia, desiring to possess some, but not all, female anatomy. So as you can see, one can feel sexual arousal upon any or across all above-mentioned types. One of the most important facets of Blanchard's theory, often not discussed, is his claim that autogynephilic transsexuals are a byproduct of misdirected heterosexual sex drive, meaning these people have a diminished capacity for heterosexual relations and pair bond formation. Those cis people, for example, have a capacity for a pair bond, and their sex drive is directed towards the opposite sex, which Blanchard seems to suggest is normal or healthy. In autogynephilic trans women, on the other hand, their sex drive is defective, and instead of turning toward people of the opposite sex, it turns toward the self. So does anyone actually start to see that there is a problem with these heteronormative concepts to begin with? As we go deeper and deeper into the theory, you'll start to see other things pop up as well. Blanchard further suggested that these autogynephilic individuals were motivated to have sex reassignment surgery because it would allow them to actualize their desires to have female bodies, desires that grow out of the root of the autogynephilic fantasies. So here he's making a casual link, stating very explicitly and clearly that one of the reasons why individuals experience gender dysphoria and would want to have gender reassignment surgery is because at the root of their desires are their autogynephilic fantasies. And what they're really seeking is not so much their gender identity, but what they're really seeking is actualization of their fantasies to actually become concrete and actualized in a human form. So this is the main gist of the Blanchard theory. Everything that I just said above about the 2 main subtypes of trans women, as well as having an issue with erotic target location or misguided target location. There's different ways that he uses it, or at least Lawrence listed in her book. So at this point, let's start by looking at all the problems associated with the theory. And let me just start by saying that there are a lot of problems with this theory. And I tried to be as mindful as a clinician from one clinician to another and to be as open-minded about this theory. And this is partially why it took me so long to make this video, because I did not want to leave any stone unturned, but I just could not escape numerous problems that I saw from the get-go. For starters, let me say you have to be very careful these days who is discussing their thoughts for or against Blanchard autogynephilia theory. There are people on YouTube and internet who are not medical providers, have zero direct experience with trans population, and are simply sharing their personal opinions, which are just that, their personal opinion, without any direct experience with trans women, or there are people who are sharing their personal stories, meaning how the Blanchard autogynephilic theory relates to them. Now, it is one thing to share your personal account and claim you're struggling with the autogynephilia. It is completely another to generalize your experiences and claim all trans women are autogynephilic. Not to mention that resonating with a theory does not also make the theory true. As I will share towards the end of the video, there are nuances missing and there are reasons why some may feel resonant to the theory. So stay tuned to the end to see the nuances that I see and that I have observed. Having said that, for someone who has close to 2 decades of direct experience with trans adults, let me say that it doesn't take much to see the numerous flaws and issues with this theory. I have written down a total of 15 personal problems I found with this theory, many of which have been already discussed and critiqued in detail by other clinicians, researchers, and providers. So let's go through them to get clarification and a deeper understanding of Blanchard autogynephilia theory. Critique number 1. Blanchard's autogynephilic theory is deeply reductionistic and overly simplistic to imply and further suggest there are only 2 subtypes of trans women, and that their desire to transition is rooted in sexuality. Anyone who has worked closely with at least several trans women knows there is far greater gender variability in the root, at the root and the cause of gender dysphoria. Gender identity and gender dysphoria stemming from the incongruency one feels is complex. Guess what? Human beings are also very complex. So to propose a theory of trans experience limited to 2 and only 2 subtypes is simply silly. Furthermore, while sexuality, in my view, is an integral part of our self-identity and does play a role, in my view at least, in our understanding of our gender identity, it is still a distinct part of who we are. Sexuality does not equal gender identity, a very important distinction. Critique point number 2. Blanchard autogynephilic theory, by suggesting only 2 sexual orientations among trans women, homosexual or autogynephilic, dismisses lesbians, bisexuals, asexuals, and other forms of sexual orientation. He also by doing so, he actually anchors his theory in heteronormative thinking, which is not only archaic, but dismissive of current times. Critique number 3. One of the biggest problems is that Blanchard theory is rooted in paraphilia. If you don't know what paraphilia is, it is a mental disorder and is a condition characterized by abnormal sexual desires, typically involving extreme or dangerous activities. Now, often paraphilia involves illegal or unethical acts, for example, non-consensual acts of sexual behavior. And while we can all agree that illegal or unethical sexual acts are not all right, note how there is no apparent rationale for why unusual sexual interests per se are mental disorders. For example, having a foot fetish, or in this case, being attracted to self as a main sexual object. In this case, who is to decide what is considered a normal sexual drive? As Charles Moser writes in his, and I will link it below, article on Blanchard's autogynephilia theory, a critique, if I assume that the term paraphilia describes, without any implications, psychopathology, recurrent intense sexual arousing fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviors, then both autogynephilia and heterosexuality could fit this definition. As you can see, heterosexuality can easily be seen as paraphilia, according to the standard definition. How the culture decide what is considered normal and abnormal in regard to consensual adult behavior is actually highly debatable. Moser further goes on to suggest that, and I totally agree, if autogynephilia were in fact paraphilia, we would expect trans women to want estrogens, but not anti-androgens, to preserve their sex drive, but actually the opposite is true. Deriving from my personal experience, if the trans women I have worked with were in fact autogynephiles, according to this theory, why do so many report tremendous relief of a decline in sex drive on estrogen? Additionally, there were studies conducted employing similar but not identical items to Blanchard measurement scale and found significant number of cis women who scored as autogynephilic. Go figure. It doesn't take much imagination to envision a person who is confident about their body, feels sexy, and when looking at themselves naked or dressed in a mirror, may experience sexual arousal towards themselves. One look at Instagram can yield many profiles of individuals enamored with themselves. Critique point number 4. Blanchard autogynephilia theory negates natural sexual erotic drives and feminine embodiment fantasies that Julia Serrano and others have written about. Now, feminine embodiment fantasies naturally occur in trans people, as Julia states in her article, The Case Against Autogynephilia. It makes sense that pre-transition transsexuals, whose gender identity is discordant with their physical sex, might actually imagine themselves inhabiting the right body in their sexual fantasies. And it makes complete sense to me too, and this is what I've seen in my practice. In fact, it is incredibly common for trans women to experience such fantasies and even experience sexual arousal upon having them or when feminizing. In my experience, as I said, trans women report such arousals to disappear once they start transitioning or achieve the congruency they're looking for. Critique number 5. Blanchard theory is rooted in heteronormative sexuality, suggesting there's a problem with the pair bond and erotic target location error. As most are clearly outlined in the article, this is inaccurate, as many trans folks move into relationships post-transition, and those who do not often have their reasons for it, some of which include challenges in finding a partner versus a problem with a pair bond. If autogynephilic trans women, as Blanchard puts it, had a pair bond problem and a misdirected heterosexual drive, they would have continued to desire to remain alone versus actually seeking relationships. Critique point number 6. Suggesting that homosexual transsexual who were always feminine desire sexual reassignment due to their sexual drives negates and completely invalidates feminine gay men, which undoubtedly exist and do not display desire to transition. Critique number 7. As Moser and others point out, there are numerous testing issues with Blanchard's cross-gender fetishism scale created to test for the presence of autogynephilia. One of the main issues with the test, and actually taking a look at the test too, it is a very obsolete test, is the presence of constant ever or never absolutes responses, leaving out the much needed supplemental context and clustering those who were occasional or rare experiences under ever and never groupings. Critique number 8. Blanchard theory negates the compensatory function seen in trans adults to engage in extremely gender stereotypically enforced careers and activities related to their assigned gender at birth to compensate for dysphoria. For example, and this is classic, Blanchard describes autogynephilic trans women as often having stereotypically male interests, hobbies, and careers. But in reality, and like I said, very classic, many trans women compensate by engaging in such activities as a way to combat dysphoria and inner dissonance by telling themselves, see, if I'm a Marine, or if I'm a Navy, or if I'm in military, or if I'm engaged in male activities, I can't be trans. It is often seen as a coping mechanism by many in order to fight dysphoria and attempt to convince their mind they're not transgender. Critique number 9. Blanchard theory negates latent gender identity, propensities, and repressed content seen in many older adults who suddenly realize they're struggling with gender dysphoria, whose personal history of gender dysphoria does not fit into Blanchard's 2 subtypes, but displays their different historical narrative. Critique number 10. Given critiques of the typology, which includes sexologist John Bancroft and Charles Allen Moser, who I mentioned above, a psychologist Margaret Nichols, including myself, and a biologist and activist Julia Serrano, who bring forth important points, including many other researchers not mentioned, Blanchard's theory cannot be generalized towards the trans population and should be clearly stated as a hypothesis versus a theory. It first disregards transmasculine and non-binary individuals. Critique number 11. Blanchard's theory does not take into account contextual history and its implications. For example, how taboo and shame guilt-driven trans identity was in 80s and 90s and still is. The fact that many trans women, their main point of reference would have been pornography. The fact that, by the way, for many trans women, their main reference point still remains to be pornography. The fact that pornography already sexualizes female bodies. The fact that sexual drive in individuals assigned male gender at birth is culturally predisposed to visual cues, hence intensifying the link between nude women in porn and one's inner desire of femininity. Critique number 12. Blanchard's theory does not open room for gender variability clearly seen today in trans and non-binary individuals, including their natural predisposed tendencies toward trans identity, and many have written about this natural predisposed tendencies. Critique number 13. As Moser and others have pointed out, there are many contradictions in account narratives in the main text published by Lawrence, which synthesizes and summarizes all of the research papers Blanchard have written. Much of the personal accounts seem to actually contradict the basic tenets of the theory, and I have seen contradictions myself. Critique number 14. Blanchard's autogynephilia theory is deeply stigmatizing, clearly, painting trans women as sexually driven by their deep, defective, erotic target location error, basing assumptions solely on heteronormative and homosexual drives and eliminating the reality of gender diversity and the reality of other sexual orientations. No wonder so many of you felt very deeply stigmatizing when this theory came out. And finally, the 15th and last critique that I personally have is, lastly, the most important point to discuss is that Blanchard's autogynephilia theory implies that sexual orientation and gender identity are not independent concepts. This is critical and crucial because, as I will discuss later, gender identity and autogynephilia as a sexual orientation, not Blanchard autogynephilia theory, do in fact exist side by side. To say that one causes the other is deeply inaccurate and negates intricate complexities within the formation of gender identity. There are many other issues with the theory which have been pointed out in detail by many other researchers, and I'm actually going to try to link as many and as much of their work as I can below the video. Now, that we have unpacked the main premise of the theory, as well as my 15 main critique points, let me go ahead and discuss personal accounts I have witnessed that may mimic one's sexual arousal and desire towards the self, and explain why that happens. In my experience of working with many transgender adults, I have observed the following, and this is going to be really important because here, and this is a part of the video where I share with you my insights why there are people who feel like Blanchard's autogynephilic theory describes them, and the main ways in which I diverge from his thinking. And also, for the sake of this discussion, I will talk about various groups, but by no means, I want to be very clear, by no means are these obsolete or definitive presentations. And I'm also not trying to group people, but I'm just trying to foster a more simplistic and better understood discussion. Also keep in mind that these are just simply most common patterns. So instead of groups, think about patterns that I have observed over my 17 years in the field. And by the way, there are so many variabilities to patterns, but these tend to cluster together most into these particular groupings. 1, I have seen numerous trans adults with early or late onset of gender dysphoria. So it doesn't matter whether your gender dysphoria started in childhood or later during puberty or later in young adulthood or in late adulthood. I have seen a lot of these individuals report experiencing some form of sexual arousal toward feminizing, thinking of themselves as women, or during sex, imagining themselves as women. Individuals in this group are experiencing what Serrano and I agree states are feminine embodiment fantasies of the self. I have seen many trans women report these tendencies tend to go away upon starting or when they actually have completed the transition, whatever that may be for them. They reported experiencing such fantasies regardless of their sexual orientation, as straight, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, etc. Additionally, these trans women had variable reporting histories ranging from exhibiting feminine traits and behaviors and tendencies to exhibiting masculine traits, behaviors, and tendencies, or even having combination of both, thus invalidating Blanchard's description of strict feminine and masculine dichotomies. These trans women's narratives and histories, along with my clinical observations, strongly contradict Blanchard's finding and groupings. Now, I know you're thinking, well, that's not enough. So what? But what about the individuals who, without a doubt, trans women who not only feel that Blanchard's theory of autogynephilia defines them, but openly call themselves autogynephilic? What about them? And if you actually don't believe that such people exist, they do. Just go on Reddit subgroups to find out. There's a lot of people. And I had adults come to me who present and claim to be autogynephilic. So there are people who feel like they really resonate with the theory. And let me explain to you why I think they feel they really resonate with the theory. So to the main question, what do I personally make of these individuals and their experiences? And most importantly, have I seen case presentations that fit Blanchard descriptions? Let me first point out that any trans person who feels connected to Blanchard theory has a right to do so. However, I feel there are key concepts that are not clearly understood in the scope of psychology that makes this person believe they fit the theory. So allow me to illuminate. Yes, to answer the question, I have seen adults who self-identify as autogynephilic and feel Blanchard's theory describes their experiences. It is very important to note that people who self-identify with Blanchard theory do in fact experience a desire towards themselves as their main sexual object. What you need to note, and what people often miss in these discussions about Blanchard's autogynephilia theory, is that nobody disputes the existence of autogynephilia. And this is super important. Nobody disputes existence of autogynephilia in a sense of natural sexual desire, albeit those who see it as paraphilia. Autogynephilia and Blanchard's autogynephilia theory are two different things. Let me say that again. Autogynephilia and Blanchard's autogynephilia theory are two different things. Sadly, they have become interchangeable because Blanchard's theory uses autogynephilia as a root cause of gender dysphoria. However, the important distinction is that autogynephilia is a stand-alone sexual drive, versus Blanchard's autogynephilia theory suggests autogynephilia as a causality to developing gender dysphoria. Remember a study I mentioned above where cis people scored as experiencing autogynephilia on the measurement scale, but who were not struggling with gender dysphoria and were not trans? So as you can see, it is crucial to remember that autogynephilia can and often is considered one's sexual orientation, similar to heterosexual, bisexual, or asexual orientations or others. Now, having said that, I have seen trans women who do experience autogynephilia as their sexual desire. Again, not to confuse with Blanchard autogynephilia theory. However, because I see autogynephilia as not paraphilia, but as a natural part of some of individual sexuality, I believe the following takes place. These individuals experience eroticized fantasies of self at an early age or puberty. Because culturally we taboo such experiences, these folks start to feel shame and guilt, which leads to a cycle of repetition, a compulsion to feel good only to feel bad, and re-engage to feel good again. Or without shame and guilt, continue to engage in sexual behaviors because it simply feels good. The million-dollar question is, how does this ever lead to gender dysphoria and transgender identity for these individuals? This is where Blanchard and I diverge greatly. He says that these sexual drives are unnatural and are due to misdirected erotic targets, resulting in desiring self and only self. As a result, Blanchard says they develop gender dysphoria and seek to transition to become women so that they can turn into the image of their ideal fantasy. Whereas I see autogynephilia as a natural sexual orientation that can and often does occur side by side with transgender identity. So both can and do coexist in transgender individuals, but one does not cause the other. In my experience, gender identity formation, as I said before in other videos, in humans is a natural byproduct of mind-body reconciliation via biopsychosocial influences and the social environment and the context we live in. Meaning, we all have natural predispositions toward gender identity, with some people being predisposed toward trans identity. As such, numerous factors contribute to those predispositions, solidifying into what we call gender identity. In accordance with this, there are trans women who experience sexual arousal towards the self as a female first. These trans women also have natural predisposed tendencies toward trans identity. But because they experience autogynephilic sexual orientation first, if anything, in my experience, it stifled the emergence of gender dysphoria because these trans women would tell themselves, it's just a sexual fetish, a sexual kink, something that has nothing to do with gender identity. This is why I heard numerous narratives of trans women telling me they avoided confronting their gender identity for decades, believing it was simply a sexual preference, which it was, in addition to also having a transgender identity. For this reason, it is possible to experience two distinct and parallel to each other phenomena: the emergence of sexual orientation, autogynephilia, and the emergence of natural occurring transgender traits. In other words, a person can have sexual drives directed towards self and have a transgender identity. This is especially why some trans women report feminine embodiment fantasies that do go away with transition, and why some report autogynephilic sexual desires that continue post their transition. Now, it's important again to pay clear attention to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is not that one links to another, but the two can simply coexist in individuals, just like autogynephilic sexual desires do exist in cis populations without leading, as Blanchard theorized, to gender dysphoria and leading, as he theorized, to desire to transition. If you're also quick to dismiss this, note, there are people who do sexually get aroused by the idea of themselves as women. Hence, they do possess, like I just said, part of their sexual orientation, but they also not desire to transition or struggle with dysphoria. Many of these people live very comfortably with their gender and their sexuality without going on to develop gender dysphoria. Many of the people claim to cross-dress for sexual preferences, sexual pleasure, and absolutely have no interest in transitioning or have no conflict with their gender identity. If autogynephilia as a root cause of trans identity was true, as Blanchard says, we would see it across the board of individuals who simply have this as their sexual preference, wouldn't we? So whereas Blanchard establishes autogynephilia as causality to gender dysphoria and trans identity, I claim a person can have autogynephilia sexual tendencies and be trans without having one to cause the other. So when people come to me, or when I hear people say they are autogynephilic, yes, they are. However, it is important to distinguish between sexual orientation versus claiming it leads to gender dysphoria and a desire to transition, all on top of having a defective erotic target locator. Now, to finish up, one of the other reasons some people claim to be autogynephilic is because when one is struggling to understand their experience, one will naturally look for it. And because many do not feel like their experience fits with the narrative of other trans women, in other words, the narratives where it started off for them not in connection to their sexual orientation, they find similarity in their narratives with that of Blanchard's accounts. I often wonder how many people who actually identify as autogynephilic are fully familiar with all the nuances and links that Blanchard proposes. How many actually understand the suggested ideas in his theory? Now, before we wrap up, let me mention another pattern I observed. I have seen a group of individuals who present with no history of gender dysphoria, past or present, who in fact express feeling neutral and good about their physical body, their physical sex, and who enjoy transgender pornography, sexual relations with trans women, or feminizing for sexual pleasure. Now, in my experience, these individuals often are not transgender, but simply need to work on accepting their sexual desires and drives as a natural part of their sexuality. But because they experience such desires, which they feel tremendous guilt and shame to due to societal taboo, they start questioning if they are trans while exhibiting no dysphoria whatsoever. It is important to make this distinction because I often wonder what will happen if such individuals, or if at least we live in a world where such things